Get your filthy, amateur hands off that 9-foot concert grand before you break something a girl from the slums could never afford to replace.
Roland Ashford's lip curled in pure disgust as he stared at the 15-year-old black girl, frozen over the keys. Nia Ellison didn't flinch. She kept her fingers hovering steady over the Steinway, her aunt's borrowed cardigan hanging loosely off her shoulders. Roland let out a cruel, mocking laugh that echoed across the gilded hall.
Sweetheart, look at the color of your skin and what you're wearing. People like you don't play Chopin. Black girls from Dunbar sweep up after it. Now drop those hands, step away from my piano, and go help your mother find a mop before security throws you out like the garbage you are.
300 millionaires in tuxedos and gowns instantly erupted into vicious laughter, while a boy in the back pulled out his phone, aiming the camera straight at Nia's face to capture her tears. Not a single soul under the crystal chandelier stood up to stop it. They truly believed they had successfully put a poor girl back in her place. But they had no idea that this cruel laughter was about to cost every single one of them their reputation. Because standing in the shadows was the greatest living legend in America, and he was about to force them all to their knees. If you're watching this, go ahead and subscribe, and drop a single word in the comments. The name of the one person who believed in you before anybody else did. Do it now. You'll understand why by the end. This is the story of Nia Ellison. 15 years old. No lessons. No teacher. No money. And a pair of hands that had never once heard themselves play out loud. Until the night, she walked into the most exclusive concert hall in the state and made 300 people forget how to breathe. It started, like most things that change a life, on an ordinary morning in a place the people in that hall would have driven past with the windows up. Nia Ellison's day began at 5:15 every morning, and not because she had anywhere important to be. It began at 5:15 because that was when the train started running on the elevated line, 2 blocks over, and the whole apartment shook when they passed. A low, rolling thunder that came up through the floorboards and into the couch cushions and rattled the fillings in your teeth. You didn't sleep through the 5:15. Nobody in that building did. Nia didn't have a bedroom. She had the living room couch, a fold-out with a spring that had worked its way loose over the years and pressed into the small of her back like a knuckle. She had a fitted sheet tucked tight around the cushions and a wool blanket folded at the foot and a plastic milk crate beside the radiator where her clothes lived. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a church dress, and 1 cardigan that used to belong to her aunt and still smelled faintly of the industrial floor wax she carried home on her clothes every night, every morning. Same drill. Fold the blanket into a square, stack the pillow on top, push the couch back into a couch, so the room forgot anybody had slept there. Make it look like furniture again. Make it look like nobody was living in the middle of the living room. That was the ritual. And Nia performed it the way some people say a prayer. Automatically, quietly, without needing to think about the words. Breakfast was toast, dry, because the butter was for dinners, and a cup of the coffee her Aunt Renee left in the pot before she fell into bed. Aunt Renee worked nights. She cleaned 3 buildings downtown between the hours of 10 at night and 6 in the morning. A bank, a law firm, and the crown jewel of her route, the Ashford Conservatory of Music. 140 years of marble and brass and mahogany that Renee Ellison knew more intimately than any of the millionaires who filled its seats. Because she was the one on her knees at 3 in the morning polishing the floor, they walked on. Renee never said "I love you" at 5:15 in the morning. Because at 5:15 in the morning she was just getting home. Coat still on, feet swollen, hands cracked from the ammonia. She said it a different way. She said it by leaving a single brass key on the kitchen counter every single morning before she collapsed. The key to the basement of Shiloh Baptist, 4 blocks down Dunbar Avenue, where an old upright piano sat rotting in the dark. She said it by winding the metronome. She said it by never once, not one time in 5 years, telling her niece that the thing she loved was a waste of time. Because here is what the people in that concert hall did not know about the girl they were laughing at. Nia Ellison could play. Not could play the way a kid who took a few lessons can play. Not could play the way the boys in bow ties at the Ashford Conservatory could play. The ones with private tutors, billed by the hour and summer intensives in Vienna, and instruments in their homes that cost as much as a house. Nia Ellison could play the way water finds the lowest ground. Inevitably, naturally, like it was the only thing the shape of her was ever built to do, and she had learned it all on a piano that did not make a sound. The upright in the basement of Shiloh Baptist had been dead for 11 years. A pipe burst above it back when Nia was a toddler, and the water came down through the ceiling and warped the soundboard and rusted the strings and swelled the hammers until half of them stuck and the other half struck nothing but a dull choket thut. The church couldn't afford to fix it and couldn't afford to haul it out. So it sat down there, in the dark against the cinder block wall, gathering dust. A piano-shaped grave. Everybody in the congregation forgot it existed. Everybody except a 5-year-old girl who used to hide down there during the long sermons, and a grandfather who came looking for her. His name was Nia Ellison, Nia's mother's father. Everybody called him Pop. He'd been the organist at Shiloh for 40 years, and before that he'd tuned pianos all over the county. Every church, every school, every parlor on the right side and the wrong side of the tracks. All of them the same to Isaiah, because a piano didn't know if you were rich or poor, and neither did he. He had hands like tree roots and an ear that could hear a string drift, a quarter tone flat from across a room. And when he found his granddaughter down in that basement with her fingers on the dead keys, pretending, he did not tell her to stop. He pulled up a folding chair. He set his brass metronome on top of the piano and started it ticking. And he said, "All right, baby girl, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." He couldn't fix the piano, but he could give her everything else. He taught her the geography of the keyboard until she could find any note with her eyes closed. He taught her the shapes of the chords, the roads between them, the way a melody could climb and fall and come home. He hummed her the great pieces in his rough, cracked voice, the Chopin nocturnes, the Beethoven sonatas, the spirituals his own grandmother had taught him, the ones with no sheet music at all, the ones you carried in your chest. And Nia's hands learned to shape them on keys that gave her back nothing but silence and the soft wooden click of the action and the tick, tick, tick of Pop's metronome keeping time. She never heard a single note she played. Not once. She played inside her own head, the way a deaf composer must have. The sound assembling itself in the space behind her eyes, imagined so completely and so constantly that it became more real to her than anything she could have heard with her ears. Pop passed away when Nia was 10. His heart, in his sleep, quiet, the way he'd have wanted it. He left her 2 things, the brass metronome and the key to the basement, which Aunt Renee had cut a copy of and left on the counter every morning since. Because she understood. The way you understand things, you cannot say out loud. That her niece was not going down into that dark to make noise. She was going down there to keep a promise. Every morning before school, Nia Ellison walked 4 blocks in the gray light, let herself into the basement of Shiloh Baptist, wound the metronome. Her grandfather left her, sat down at a piano that had not made a sound in 11 years, and played Minmus Daunt, scales, etude, the impossible mountains of the repertoire, the pieces that broke conservatory students twice her age. Chopin's Ballad in G minor, all 4 movements of thunder and heartbreak, from memory, at full tempo, on dead keys, in the dark, alone. The keys never asked what she was wearing. The keys never charged her tuition. The keys never once cared whose hands found them in the dark. They just gave her back exactly what she put in, which was everything. Uptown, 40 minutes and 400 years of history away, sat the Ashford Conservatory of Music. If Shiloh's basement was a grave, the Ashford was a temple. Marble columns, 40 feet tall, a grand foyer with a mosaic floor and a staircase that curved up into gold. Practice rooms with grand pianos in every one, tuned weekly by technicians who flew in from 3 states over. A recital hall with acoustics so perfect that a whisper from the stage could be heard in the last row, and a chandelier that had been imported from Prague and hung so heavy they'd had to reinforce the ceiling to hold it. This was where the city's wealth came to make sure its children could play. Tuition ran $40,000 a year, and that didn't cover the private lessons, or the summer programs, or the instruments, or the recommended master classes that cost more than most families made in a season. The parents who dropped their children off at the Ashford wore the confidence of people who had never once in their lives been told there was a room they couldn't enter, and the man who ran it walked through the front doors every morning like a king walking into a building with his name carved above the arch. Because it was Roland Ashford, 3rd generation. His grandfather had founded the place. His father had built the recital hall, and Roland had inherited it all along with an unshakable belief that talent was something you purchased, and that the people who couldn't afford to purchase it simply didn't have any. He was a tall man, silver at the temples, expensively dressed, and he ran the conservatory the way a man runs a private club, by deciding, carefully, who got to come in. Every applicant to the Ashford scholarship track had to pass through a pre-screening committee, and the pre-screening committee was Roland Ashford. And Roland Ashford had a way of looking at an application, the neighborhood, the last name, the school, the photograph, and knowing, before a single note was played, whether this was Ashford material. In 15 years of running that committee, the number of full scholarship students he had admitted from neighborhoods like Dunbar could be counted on one hand with fingers left over. That was the fence, and Roland Ashford held the only key. His son, Chandler, was 17, and he was the conservatory's prized pony. Not because Chandler was the most gifted student in the building. The faculty knew, quietly, that he wasn't, but because Chandler was an Ashford, and Ashfords did not lose. He'd been groomed his whole life for one moment, and that moment was 3 weeks away, because in 3 weeks, the Ashford Conservatory would host the Vanguard Prize, once a decade, a name, in the classical world so large it barely fit through the door, came to the Ashford to award a single prize. They called it the Vanguard, a full scholarship. Yes, but more than that, the winner made their public debut on the Ashford stage, and the winner became the personal student of the artist who awarded it. It was the kind of prize that did not just change a young musician's year. It changed the entire arc of a life. It turned a talented kid into a name, and this year, the artist coming to award it was Silas Munro. If you know classical music, you already felt something when you read that name. And if you don't, let me tell you what Silas Munro was. He was 72 years old, and he was, by nearly universal agreement, the greatest living pianist in America. He had played every hall worth playing on 6 continents. Presidents had wept in his front rows. But that was not the whole of it. And it was not even the most important part of it, because 50 years earlier, Silas Monroe had been a poor black kid from a mill town who taught himself on a busted piano in a church basement. And when he'd finally gotten good enough to be undeniable, he had been turned away from the front doors of half the conservatories in this country, told to use the service entrance, told the audience wasn't ready, told, in 1,000 polite and impolite ways, that the piano was not for his kind. He had broken every one of those doors down anyway. He had spent 5 decades becoming so great that the same halls that once turned him away now put his name on their marquees and begged him to return. And now, at 72, he flew from city to city once a decade doing one thing, and one thing only, looking for the next kid the system was about to lose. He knew that kid was out there. He knew it the way you know a thing in your bones when you have lived it. He knew that somewhere, right now, in a basement or a garage or on a keyboard drawn on a piece of cardboard, there was a child playing in the dark, who was better than anyone in any conservatory, and who would never be found, because the front doors were closed and the person holding the key had already decided they didn't belong. Silas Monroe had spent 50 years trying to find that kid before the world threw them away. He just didn't know that this time she was going to find him. Nia Ellison was not on the guest list for the Vanguard Prize Gala. Of course she wasn't. The gala was black tie, $500 a plate. The entire moneyed music world of the city, packed into the Ashford's grand foyer for cocktails, before filing into the recital hall to watch Chandler Ashford, the presumptive favorite, the safe bet, the Ashford, perform for Silas Monroe and, everyone assumed, walk away with the prize. Nia was there because her Aunt Renee was there, because the conservatory's regular event staff had come up 2 people short that night, and Roland Ashford's assistant had called Renee's cleaning company at 4 in the afternoon and demanded warm bodies to set up chairs, refill water pitchers, and clear glasses. Cash, no question. And Renee, who never turned down $1, had said yes. And then she'd looked at her niece, who had nowhere to be, and a school uniform that could pass for black and white in dim light. And she'd made a decision she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. Come with me, she'd said. You'll carry water. You'll stay quiet. You'll make $40. And you'll get to be inside that hall. You'll get to hear it. Baby. A real one. A real piano. Played on a real stage. Just once. Because Aunt Renee knew. She was the only living person who knew what Nia did every morning in that basement. She had come down there once, a year ago, unable to sleep after a night shift. And she had stood at the top of the basement stairs in the dark and watched her niece's hands move across those silent keys with a fluency that had stopped her cold. The hands of a master on an instrument that made no sound. And she had understood, standing there, that she was watching one of 2 things. Either the saddest thing she'd ever seen, or a miracle waiting for a door to open. She had never told Nia she'd watched. She just kept winding the metronome. So that was how Nia Ellison came to be standing at the back of the Ashford Conservatory's grand foyer on the night of the Vanguard Prize, in her aunt's cardigan over her school uniform, a pitcher of ice water in her hands. Invisible, in a room full of people who had paid $500 each not to see her. She didn't mind being invisible. Invisible meant she could watch, and Nia watched everything. She watched the way the wealthy moved through that room. The ease of them. The certainty. She watched the students in their concert blacks, their nervous parents hovering, She watched a man she'd never seen a photograph of but knew instantly. The way you know a mountain is a mountain. An old black man in a simple dark suit. No entourage. Standing quietly by a column with a glass of water in his hand. Watching the room, with eyes that missed nothing. Silas Monroe. Nia's breath caught. She had heard him. On the church's ancient CD player. On a scratched recording Pop had treasured. She had heard those hands. And now those hands were 60 feet away, holding a water glass. And she had to remind herself to keep breathing. And she watched the piano. They had rolled it out onto the stage of the recital hall. And through the open doors, she could see it. A 9-foot Steinway concert grand. Lit up. The stage lights catching the black lacquer, until it looked like a pool of still water. The most beautiful object Nia Ellison had ever seen in her life. She had never touched a piano like that. She had never touched a piano that worked. She stood at the back of the foyer, holding her pitcher of water. And she looked at that instrument, the way a person dying of thirst looks at the sea. She had no idea, standing there, that in less than an hour she would be sitting at those keys with 300 people holding their breath. Because the evening was about to go very, very wrong for Chandler Ashford, they took their seats at 8. Nia stood along the side wall of the recital hall with the other staff, water pitchers in hand, told to be still and silent. And she was glad to be told, because she would have been still and silent anyway. She was inside the temple. She could feel the acoustics of the room, that famous perfect hush. And her whole body was listening. Roland Ashford took the stage first and welcomed his guests with the smooth warmth of a man who has never in his life doubted he belonged behind a microphone. He thanked the donors. He thanked the extraordinary Silas Monroe for gracing them with his presence. And then he introduced the evening's featured performer, the young man who would be playing for the maestro tonight. His son, Chandler Ashford, who would perform the first movement of Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto in a solo arrangement. It was an insane choice. The Rachmaninoff Third is one of the most punishing pieces ever written for the instrument. A piece that has broken professional careers, and to hand it to a 17-year-old on the biggest night of his life, in front of the greatest pianist alive, was not a display of Chandler's talent. It was a display of his father's ego. Chandler walked out to polite applause. He sat. He adjusted the bench. He lifted his hands, and for about 90 seconds, it was fine. The opening was gentle, and Chandler had practiced the opening 10,000 times. And his hands knew it cold. Nia, along the side wall, closed her eyes and let the sound of a real concert, grand, in a real hall, wash over her for the very first time. And it nearly buckled her knees. The size of it, the way a single note bloomed and hung and filled the entire space. She had imagined this sound her whole life. Hearing it was like meeting a person you'd only ever known through letters. Her eyes stung. She kept them closed and she listened. And then she heard the crack. It came in the development, where Rachmaninoff piles the difficulty on like an avalanche, where the left hand has to leap and the right hand has to thunder, and the whole thing accelerates toward a peak that demands everything a pianist has. Nia's eyes opened. She wasn't listening as an audience member anymore. She was listening the way her grandfather taught her to listen. And she heard, before anyone else in that room, the exact moment Chandler Ashford's technique failed him. He's voicing the octaves as octaves. She thought, he's hitting both notes at the same weight. So the inner line disappears, and he loses the melody in the middle of the storm. And once you lose the line, you're just playing loud. And once you're just playing loud, you can't get back. She was right. It's a real thing. In that passage, The pianist has to bring out a melody buried inside the crashing chords. You have to lean the sound onto the top of your hand and let the rest fall softer, or the whole architecture collapses into noise. And Chandler, who had been drilled to play it big, I was playing it all at the same crushing volume, and the melody had drowned. And now he was lost inside his own hands with no line to follow home. He rushed. He tried to power through. His left hand landed a leap short. A wrong bass note boomed through that perfect hall like a dropped dish, and the whole room flinched. And Chandler's shoulders climbed up around his ears. And Nia watched a 17-year-old boy come apart in real time in front of 300 people and the greatest pianist alive. He stopped, restarted the passage, broke again in the same place. His hands were shaking now. He tried a third time, and it fell apart worse. And there was the horrible silence in that beautiful room. And Chandler Ashford sat frozen at the keyboard with his eyes locked on the music, looking to the wings, looking for his father, looking for anybody to tell him what to do. There was no fixing it from the wings. There was only one thing wrong, and only one way to fix it. And it lived in a passage. Everyone in that hall was too polite to mention, and too untrained to diagnose. Everyone, except a 15-year-old girl, standing along the side wall with a pitcher of ice water in her hands, and Nia Ellison, who had played that exact avalanche of a piece 1,000 times on dead keys in a dark basement, who had solved that exact problem for herself years ago, who knew in her bones what was broken and how to make it whole. Nia Ellison did the most dangerous thing a person in her position could possibly do. She set down her pitcher of water, and she said, out loud, into the silence, not to the crowd, barely even to herself. He's playing the octaves flat, the melodies in the top voice. If he'd just lean it, it would sing. It wasn't loud, but that hall was built to carry a whisper to the last row, and the man standing 60 feet away by the column, the old man with the water glass, the greatest pianist alive, turned his head. Roland Ashford heard it too. And Roland Ashford did what men like him always do when someone with nothing makes them look small in front of everyone they are trying to impress. He did not get quieter. He got louder. He came off the stage steps fast, microphone still in his hand, and he turned toward the side wall, toward the girl in the borrowed cardigan, and his voice filled the whole room, amplified, unmisable, so that every donor and every parent and every student and Silas Monroe himself could hear it. I'm sorry. Did the help have a note for us? The laughter started before he even finished the sentence. The relieved kind, the kind a room reaches for when it's been sitting in an unbearable silence and someone hands it a target. The kind that picks the winning side before the fight has even started. Nia didn't drop her eyes. That was the first thing Silas Monroe noticed about her, and he would remember it for the rest of his life. The girl did not drop her eyes. Do you play? Sweetheart, Ashford said, dripping. He was walking toward her now, unhurried. A big cat who's seen a small thing move. Do you play the Rachmaninoff third? Or do you just have opinions about your betters? Because, from where I'm standing, you're holding a water pitcher, and I don't remember putting a concert pianist on tonight's catering invoice. More laughter. Cruder now. A woman in the third row said something behind her program to the woman beside her, and they both smiled. Near the back, a boy in a bow tie lifted his phone and hit the red circle and pointed the camera at the girl's face. And the little glowing rectangle floated in the dark like an eye. This, Ashford announced, sweeping his arm around the marble, and the gold and the chandelier from Prague, is the Ashford Conservatory. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand where you are? This is not a soup kitchen, And it is certainly not open mic night. Get your hands off that instrument. But Nia's hands weren't on the instrument. Not yet. Her hands were at her sides. And they were perfectly still. And Silas Monroe, watching from his column, noticed that too. That the girl's hands, which should have been shaking, were as steady as a surgeon's. People like you don't play Chopin, Ashford said, and he smiled, because he thought he was landing the knockout. People like you sweep up after it. Now step away and go find your mother a mop before I have you both removed and you never work in this city again. And there it was, the whole ugly machine, out in the open, under the crystal and the gold, the neighborhood, the last name, the uniform, the color of her hands, everything Roland Ashford had spent 15 years using to decide who got to come through the front door, said out loud at last, into a microphone. In front of 300 people who laughed, not one of them stood up. Not one of them said, "That's enough." A mother in the second row turned her face away, uncomfortable, and kept her mouth shut. A young faculty accompanist named Elias Ward, standing in the wings, went very still and stared at the floor. And we will come back to Elias, because his silence in this exact moment is going to cost him sleep for a very long time. And it is going to matter more than anything Roland Ashford says tonight. Nia Ellison absorbed every word. No tears, no trembling jaw, no dramatic stare-down. She had been underestimated her entire life. She was not surprised by cruelty. And it is surprise that makes you flinch. She simply stood there and let it wash over her the way she'd let 1,000 mornings of silence wash over her. And she waited, and into that laughter, the old man by the column set down his water glass. He didn't hurry. He crossed the front of the hall with the slow, unbothered walk of a man who has spent 72 years and has never once let anyone rush him. And the laughter died as he moved. The way noise dies when the largest person in the room decides to speak. He walked to the side wall. He stopped in front of the girl, and he did not introduce himself. And he did not acknowledge Roland Ashford. And he did not say a single word about the ugliness that had just filled the room. He just looked at her, and he said, quietly, in a voice the whole hushed hall could now hear, "Say that again?" "About the octaves." Nia looked up at Silas Monroe. "He's playing them flat," she said, simply, no fear in it. Even weight, top and bottom. So the melody in the top voice drowns. And once the line's gone, he's got nothing to steer by. So he just gets louder, and the whole passage falls apart. She paused. You have to lean it onto the fifth finger. Let the bottom of the chord fall away underneath. Then it sings, even when it's loud, especially when it's loud. For a moment, Silas Monroe did not move, because that was not a guess. That was not a kid repeating something she'd read. That was a diagnosis, clean and correct and delivered without a flicker of doubt. The kind of thing Monroe himself might have said to a graduate student. And it had come out of a 15-year-old holding a water pitcher in a borrowed cardigan, who had just been told to go find a mop. He tilted his head. He was 90% sure now, and he wanted to be 100. "Show me," he said. "Not on that one." He nodded toward the stage, toward Chandler, who was still sitting frozen and white-faced at the keys. "Come here." There was a smaller piano off to the side of the stage, a rehearsal upright, the staff used for warm-ups. Monroe walked to it, and after a second, Nia Ellison walked to it too. The whole hall silent now. 300 people who, a minute ago, had been laughing now, watching a girl in a school uniform cross a room she had been told she didn't belong in. "Play me the opening of the Chopin G minor ballad," Monroe said. "Just the first page." He said it the way you'd ask a carpenter which nail he'd use. Casual. A test. He was already fairly sure of the answer to. Nia sat down at the upright. She flexed her hands once. They were rough. You could see it. The calluses. The cracked knuckles. And hands that scrubbed floors on the weekends to help her aunt. She set them on the keys. And here's the thing that no one in that hall knew. The thing that not even Silas Monroe could have guessed. The thing that made what happened next almost unbearable. Nia Ellison had never heard herself play. Not once in her entire life. 10 years at a dead piano. In a dark basement. 10 years of playing entirely inside her own head. Every note imagined. Never sounded but. She had shaped this exact ballade 10,000 times in silence. And she had never once heard what her own hands could do. So, when she pressed the first notes of Chopin's G minor ballad, that quiet, questioning, aching opening line that has broken 100 years of hearts, the sound came out, real, ringing, filling the space. Here's Nia Ellison heard her own hands for the first time in her life. Her breath hitched. Just once. She almost stopped. And then she didn't. Because the thing she had promised her grandfather in that basement was that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it right. So she played through the catch in her chest. And the opening line unfolded from her fingers into that perfect, famous, acoustic. And it was so tender and so sure and so right that a woman in the second row put her hand over her mouth. It was only a page. Monroe had asked for a page, but he did not stop her at the end of the page. He let her keep going, and the whole hall let her keep going. And Roland Ashford stood at the foot of his own stage, microphone dead in his hand, and watched his entire evening, his whole careful story about money and pedigree and who belonged and who did not, begin to come apart. One perfect phrase at a time. Silas Monroe listened, with his eyes closed, and when at last Nia lifted her hands from the keys, into a silence, so total you could hear the chandelier's crystals faintly ringing, the old man opened his eyes, and they were wet. And he said one word, enough. Not because he'd heard too much, because he'd heard everything he needed to. Roland Ashford found his voice. He always did. This is absurd, he said. And the microphone shrieked with feedback as he lifted it. Maestro. With respect. This is a catering employee. We have a program tonight. We have a featured student. My son. Your son, Silas Monroe said. Not unkindly. Is going to be a fine musician one day. If you ever let him play a piece, he can carry, instead of a piece that makes you look important. But that is a conversation for another night. The room went very quiet. Monroe turned to Nia. What's your name? Nia Ellison. Where do you study? Nia Ellison. And here Nia almost smiled, though there was no bitterness in it. I don't, she said. There's a piano in the basement of my church. It's been broken since I was little. It doesn't make any sound. I play on that. You could feel the sentence land in that room. 300 people trying to do the math on it and failing. A broken piano. That doesn't make a sound. The ballad they had just heard, played by hands that had learned it in total silence. Monroe closed his eyes for a moment, and something crossed his face that most of the people in that room would never understand, but that a few of the older ones did, because they knew his story. They knew where he'd started. They knew about the mill town and the church basement and the service entrances, and they understood that Silas Monroe was not just hearing a talented girl. He was hearing his own life, played back to him across 50 years. Standing in front of him in a borrowed cardigan. Roland, Monroe said, and now his voice was iron. The Vanguard is my prize to award, not yours. You brought me here to find the most extraordinary young musician in this city. So, I am going to hear this young woman play properly on the concert instrument, right now, on my authority. He turned to the frozen boy at the big Steinway. Chandler. So, would you give her the bench? Chandler Ashford stood up. He was 17, and he had just lived through the worst night of his young life. But he was not, it turned out, his father, and something in the boy's face was almost relieved as he stepped back from the keys. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, go ahead. Roland Ashford's face had gone a deep, blotched red. If she embarrasses herself on that stage, he said. Lo now. A threat with teeth. All the amplified showmanship gone. She and her aunt clean out their lockers tonight, and neither one of them ever sets foot in this building again. I don't care whose authority. She's not going to embarrass herself, said a voice from the wings. Everyone turned. It was Elias Ward. Elias Ward was 44 years old, and he had been a staff accompanist and part-time piano technician at the Ashford Conservatory for 11 years. And he had been a coward for at least the last 2 of them. Here is what nobody in that hall knew about Elias Ward. He tuned the pianos at 3 churches around the city, on the side, for a little extra money. And one of those churches was Shiloh Baptist on Dunbar Avenue. And 2 years ago, on a Saturday morning, he had let himself into the basement of Shiloh to check on the old ruined upright. The pastor kept asking him to just look at. Please, one more time. And he had found a 13-year-old girl sitting at it in the dark, playing the Chopin ballad on keys that made no sound. Her lips moving, her whole body, inside music he could not hear. He had stood at the top of those stairs for 20 minutes, unable to move, watching a child play a masterpiece on a dead instrument with technique cleaner than half the students paying $40,000 a year at the Ashford. And when she'd finally stopped, he'd introduced himself, and he'd learned her name. And for 2 years, Elias Ward had known. He knew Nia Ellison existed. He knew what her hands could do. He had it in his power, at any moment, across 2 years, to walk into Roland Ashford's office and say, there is a girl in a church basement in Dunbar who is better than anyone in this building. And she has no money, and no teacher. And if we don't find her, we're going to lose her. And he had said nothing, because Roland Ashford ran the conservatory, because Roland Ashford decided who got scholarships, and who got hired, and who kept their job, because Elias had a mortgage and an ex-wife and 2 kids and a career that lived or died by the goodwill of a man who had made it very clear, in 100 small ways, exactly what kind of student was Ashford material and what kind was not, because it was easier to drive past that church than to walk into that office, because the fence was closed, and Elias Ward had decided, 2 years running, that it was not his job to open it. So he'd kept his mouth shut, and every Saturday for 2 years, when he tuned the pianos at the other churches, he'd driven past Shiloh, and slowed down, and felt the guilt sit on his chest like a stone, and driven on, until tonight, until he stood in the wings and watched Roland Ashford call that same girl the help, and heard 300 people laugh, and heard himself say nothing yet again, and then watched her sit down and play the opening of that ballad, and heard it come out into the light at last, and understood, all the way down to the bottom of him, that his silence had almost cost the world this. So, Elias Ward stepped out of the wings. She's not going to embarrass herself, he said again, and his voice was shaking. And he didn't care. I've heard her play, for 2 years, on the dead upright in the basement of Shiloh Baptist on Dunbar. He looked at Roland Ashford, his employer, the man who signed his checks, and he said the thing he should have said 2 years ago. I've known about her for 2 years. Roland, I've known she was the most gifted musician I've ever heard in my life. And I said nothing, because I was afraid of you. And I'm ashamed of that. I'm ashamed of it in front of everybody. But I'm not going to be ashamed of it for 1 more minute. He walked past Ashford, past Monroe, up onto the stage, to the great black Steinway. And he did the one thing Roland Ashford had refused to do. The one small mechanical act of grace that Chandler had been too frozen to think of. He reached down and adjusted the height of the bench for a girl who had never in her life sat at a 9-foot concert grand. He said it right. He checked the pedal, and then he stepped back and, very quietly, so only she could hear, he told her the one thing he knew she needed. It's louder than you think. Nia, don't back away from it. Play like the silence isn't there anymore. And Nia Ellison, in her aunt's cardigan, over her school uniform, with cracked hands and no lessons and no teacher and no money, and 10 years of silence behind her, walked up onto the stage of the Ashford Conservatory of Music and sat down at the most beautiful instrument she had ever touched, in front of 300 people who had laughed at her not 10 minutes before, and one old man who had waited 50 years to find her. She looked out at the hall. She found, along the side wall, the one face in that whole room that mattered, her Aunt Renee, in her cleaning company's polo shirt, the water pitcher forgotten in her hands, and tears already running down her face because Renee had known. Renee had always known. And Renee had been waiting 5 years for the sound she was about to hear. Nia set her rough hands on the keys, and somewhere across town, in the basement of a church, a brass metronome sat silent on a dead piano, and it was as if her grandfather were sitting right there beside her, folding chair pulled up, saying what he always said. All right, baby girl, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. She began to play. She did not begin with the Rachmaninoff. She began with the ballad, the G minor, the one she'd shown, Monroe, and she started it again from the top. And this time she did not stop at the first page. And this time, the whole hall, the whole gilded, hushed, perfect hall, went with her. The opening was a question, quiet and searching, and she asked it so gently that people leaned forward without realizing they'd moved. And then the theme arrived, that heartbreaking singing line, and it came up out of the piano like something rising from underwater. And Nia, who had never once heard herself, who was hearing every note she played for the very first time in her life, even as she played it, did not back away from the sound the way Elias had feared. She leaned into it. She let it be enormous. Every phrase was a thing she had imagined 10,000 times in the dark and was now hearing born into the air. And you could see it on her face. The astonishment of it, the almost unbearable joy of finally hearing the thing she had carried in silence her whole life. The room stopped breathing, and then she reached the storm. Because the Chopin G minor ballad does not stay tender. It builds, and it darkens, and it accelerates toward a coda that is one of the most violent, difficult, thundering passages in the entire piano repertoire. A full-speed avalanche of chromatic scales and crashing octaves that demands everything a pianist has and then demands more. Conservatory students spend years on that coda. Grown professionals fear it. Nia Ellison detonated it. Her hands became a blur. And the sound that came out of that Steinway was not the sound of a 15-year-old. It was the sound of the elevated train coming up through the floorboards. It was the sound of 11 years of silence, breaking all at once. She threw the full weight of her body into the keys, and the octaves crashed, and the scales ripped up and down the keyboard like tearing cloth. And here is the thing. Here is the thing that had broken Chandler Ashford 20 minutes earlier. Buried inside all that thunder, riding on top of the chaos, clear as a voice in a storm, was the melody. The line leaned onto the top of her hand exactly the way she'd told them it had to be. Singing through the avalanche. Never once drowned. Never once lost. She had solved this. Years ago, alone, in the dark, on a piano that made no sound. And now she was playing it on a 9-foot Steinway in a perfect hall in front of the greatest pianist alive. And it was flawless. And it was ferocious. And it was the single most powerful thing anyone in that room had ever heard a human being do. Silas Monroe was on his feet. Nobody saw him stand. The coda drove toward its final crashing descent, that headlong plunge to the bottom of the keyboard. And Nia hit the last chord with everything she had. Both arms. Full weight. And it rang out into the hall and hung there. Enormous. Shaking the crystal of the chandelier so faintly you could hear it answer. And then she lifted her hands, and there was silence. Total silence. The kind of silence that is louder than any sound. The kind where 300 people who have just witnessed something they will describe to their grandchildren sit frozen, needing to look at another person's face to confirm that what they saw was real. 3 full seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then one pair of hands, somewhere in the dark of that hall, began to clap. Just one. Then another. Then 5. Then 20. And then the dam broke. And the applause hit that room like a wave hitting a seawall. And it pulled people out of their seats before their brains gave them permission. 300 people in tuxedos and gowns on their feet. Roaring. For a poor black girl in a borrowed cardigan, who 10 minutes ago, they had laughed out of the room. The mother in the second row, who had turned her face away, was standing with her hands above her head. The people who had laughed the hardest were clapping the hardest. Now, not because they'd earned it, but because the moment was bigger than their shame, and they knew it. But Nia Ellison was not finished. Because Silas Monroe was walking toward the stage. He came up the stage steps, slowly, 72 years old. And the ovation faltered and hushed as people realized what was happening. That the maestro himself was crossing the stage toward the girl. He did not say anything to her at first. He sat down at the second piano. The rehearsal upright they'd rolled toward the wing. And he flexed his old hands. And he looked at Nia Ellison across the stage. And he smiled. A small, private, dangerous smile. The smile of a man who has finally, after 50 years of looking, found what he came for and wants to be sure. And then Silas Monroe began to play, not a written piece. He improvised. He laid down a simple theme. 4 bars. A phrase with an open door at the end of it. Pose la question. And then he lifted his hands and looked at Nia. And the whole hall understood. All at once. What was happening? He was not testing whether she could execute anymore. He'd seen that. He was testing whether she could create. Whether there was a musician in there, and not just a machine. He had asked her a question, in the only language that mattered. And now he was waiting to see if she could answer. Nia Ellison did not hesitate. She took his 4 bars. And she answered them. She caught his theme and turned it over and handed it back to him. Changed. Developed. Hairs. With a door open at the end for him. And Monroe laughed out loud. Actually laughed. Delighted. A boy's laugh in an old man's chest. And he answered her, throwing the theme higher, harder, more complex. And she caught it again and threw it back. And back and forth it went across that stage. The greatest pianist alive, and a 15-year-old who'd learned in a basement, trading a melody like two people who had been playing together their whole lives. Faster and richer, and more astonishing with every exchange. And the hall watched with its mouth open because you could not fake this. You could not buy this. No amount of tuition on earth could purchase what was happening on that stage. And then Nia did the thing that no one, not Monroe, not Elias, not her own aunt, could have predicted, because here is what she had been holding back. Here's the card she'd kept face down on the table this whole time. When the theme came back around to her hands one more time, Nia Ellison did not answer it with more Chopin, or more of Monroe's language, or anything from any conservatory or any recording. She answered it with a melody her grandfather used to hum to her in that basement. An old spiritual, one with no sheet music, one his own grandmother had taught him. And her grandmother before that, carried down through hands and voices in the dark for 200 years, because nobody had ever written it down and nobody had ever needed to. Nia took Silas Monroe's brilliant, sophisticated, conservatory theme, and she wove her grandfather's spiritual through the middle of it, married them, made them one thing, the high tradition and the deep one, the concert hall and the church basement, braided together by a 15-year-old's hands into something that had never existed before in the history of the world and would never exist again. It was not just that she could play, it was that she had something to say. She had a voice, her own. Hers. Silas Monroe took his hands off the keys. He couldn't play anymore. He just sat there and listened. An old man with tears streaming down his face. As a child finished the thought he'd started and turned it into something he himself could never have made, because he had not lived her exact life. And she had, when she brought it home at last. A final chord. Soft this time. Tender. The spiritual resolving under the concert theme like a benediction. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't shock, it was reverence. And then Silas Monroe did something that no one in the 50-year history of his legend had ever seen him do for anyone. He stood up from the piano, and he turned to face this 15-year-old girl in a borrowed cardigan. And Silas Monroe, the greatest living pianist in America. A man who had played for presidents. A man whose hands were insured for more than the building Nia slept in. Silas Monroe bowed to her. Deep, formal. The bow one master gives another. The bow that says, I see you. And you are my equal. And it is my honor to be in the same room as your hands. The bow that a poor black kid from a mill town, turned away from the front doors of half the conservatories in America 50 years ago, had waited his entire life to be able to give to the next one. The hall came apart. There is no other way to describe it. People were weeping. People were standing on the seats. The ovation went on and refused to end. And in the middle of it all sat Nia Ellison at a 9-foot Steinway, hands in her lap, looking out at 300 people on their feet. And the only thing she did, the only thing, was find her aunt's face along the side wall, Nia Ellison, in her cleaning polo, crying. And when their eyes met across that roaring hall, Aunt Renee did not cheer, and she did not wave. She just nodded, slow, certain, the way you nod at a thing you have always known, the way Nia's grandfather used to nod, counting time that only he could hear. It took a long time for the hall to quiet. When it finally did, Silas Monroe walked to Nia at the keys, and he took both of her hands in both of his plotter, those cracked, calloused, floor-scrubbing hands, and he held them up, gently, and he looked at them the way a jeweler looks at a stone. And then he looked at her, and he spoke. And because the hall was so silent now, Everybody heard it. I have been doing this for 50 years. He said, I have heard children come out of programs that cost $250,000 who cannot play half as true as what you just did with your bare hands on a borrowed bench. You learned the greatest music ever written on a piano that makes no sound. In a basement. In the dark. With no one to teach you, and no reason on this earth to believe anyone would ever hear you. His voice broke. He let it, and you kept the promise anyway. Whatever promise you made. You kept it. I know. Because I made the same one. A long time ago. In a room a lot like that basement. He turned, still holding her hands. And he faced the hall, faced the donors, the parents, the students, the man with his name on the building. And his voice was not gentle anymore. The Vanguard Prize, Silas Monroe said, is awarded to Nia Ellison. The hall erupted again, but Monroe wasn't finished. And he raised one hand, and it quieted. Because when Silas Monroe raised a hand, rooms went still, and I want everyone in this hall to hear the rest of it. He said, this young woman was 4 blocks from your front door for 10 years. She was in a church basement in Dunbar, and you never found her. Not because she was hiding, but because you weren't looking. Because this building has a committee that decides who gets to be heard before a single note is played. Because someone in this institution looked at a neighborhood and a last name and decided, in advance, who was material and who was not. He did not look at Roland Ashford. He didn't have to. I know how that works. I have been on the wrong side of that door my whole life. And I am telling you, tonight, that it stops, or I take my name, and my prize, and I never darken this hall again. He looked down at Nia, and then, more quietly, to her alone. But the hall still heard it. Anything you want to say. And Nia Ellison, who could have said anything, who could have made a speech, who had every right in the world to look out at the 300 people who had laughed at her and let them have it. Nia Ellison thought about it for a second, and then she said the truest thing, and the smallest, and it landed harder than anything Roland Ashford had said all night. I just wanted to hear it out loud. She said, that's all. I just wanted to hear what it sounded like. For real. One time, she looked down at the keys of the great black piano. It sounds even better than I thought. There was not a dry eye in that hall. Roland Ashford tried. Of course, men like him always do. He came toward the stage with a new expression on his face. Smooth now. Reasonable. Suddenly generous. The earlier arrogance tucked away. Nia. It's Nia. Yes. I think what we're all realizing tonight is that the Ashford has a responsibility to talent like yours. And I'd like to personally see to it that you're enrolled in our most prestigious program. He was reaching. He was trying to grab hold of the thing he had mocked 10 minutes ago and rewrite the whole night into a story where he was the one who discovered her. A story where he held the pen. Elias Ward stepped between them. He didn't do it with a speech. Or with volume. He just moved. Quietly. Until he was standing beside Nia. Close enough to mean something. And he addressed Silas Monroe directly. As if Roland Ashford were not standing 3 feet away. I'd like to help however I can. Maestro. Elias said. But not here. Not under him. He finally turned and looked at his employer. The man who signed his checks. The man he'd been afraid of for 11 years. And there was something almost free in his face. I kid. Roland. Effective tonight. I should have walked into your office 2 years ago and told you about this girl. And I didn't. Because I was scared of you. I'm not scared of you anymore. It turns out you're a very small man, in a very large building. He turned back to Monroe. There's a community center on Dunbar, 2 blocks from her church. I'm going to put pianos in it, real ones. And I'm going to teach any kid who walks in the door, whether their family has a dime or not. If you'll lend your name to that, it'll change everything. If you won't, I'm doing it anyway. Silas Monroe looked at Elias Ward for a long moment. Put my name on it, he said, and send me the students you can't handle. I've got a few good years left. The hall emptied slowly that night, the way rooms do when something has happened inside them that people need to carry out carefully. So as not to spill it, the donors folded their programs and gathered their coats. But the conversations were different. Lower. More careful. Every knot of wealthy people drifting toward the doors carried some version of the same sentence. Did you see that girl? Did you hear her? And underneath it, quieter. A question that a few of them had started asking themselves. The question that changes everything. Once you've heard it, who else is out there? Who else is 4 blocks from a door we never bothered to open? Nia stood near the stage, and the adrenaline was draining out of her now, and her hands were beginning to shake. Not from fear, but from the release that comes after you have held yourself together for far longer than anyone should have to. Silas Monroe pressed a card into her hand, his private number on the back of it, and squeezed her shoulder. This week, he said. We start this week. Bring your hands. I'll handle everything else. And then he was gone, the largest man in the room, walking out as quietly as he'd come in. Roland Ashford sat alone in the front row of his own recital hall for a long time after everyone else had gone. Nobody was asking him about donations, or programs, or his son. The gravity of the room had shifted away from him in the space of an hour, and it was never coming back. And he knew it, and he just sat there looking at the stage. At the bench Elias had adjusted, at the great black piano, at the spot where a 15-year-old had undone 3 generations of gatekeeping in 10 minutes and a single ballady. The live stream from the boy's phone was already circulating. 1,200 strangers had watched it live, and it would be 100,000 by morning. And then it would be more. He didn't know that yet. He would by tomorrow. He didn't get up. He just sat, and Nia Ellison walked to the side wall, to the one person she'd been looking for all night. And Aunt Renee set down her forgotten pitcher of water and opened her arms. And the girl in the borrowed cardigan walked into them. And neither one of them said a word. There was nothing to say. Renee had known. Renee had always known. She'd been winding that metronome for 5 years, and leaving that key on the counter for 5 years, and never once telling her niece to stop. And tonight, I finally gotten to hear the sound she'd been waiting for. The sound she had carried on faith alone through 1,000 exhausted mornings. Pop heard that. Renee whispered into Nia's hair. Wherever he is, he heard every note, and he's keeping time. He never stopped keeping time. Nia closed her eyes and let the words land where they needed to land. By the time the sun came up, the whole country had heard her too. The boy in the bow tie, who'd pointed his phone at Nia's face, hunting for tears, had, without ever meaning to, filmed the most important thing that would happen in classical music that year. He'd caught all of it. The sneer, the word help, the 300 people laughing, the girl who wouldn't drop her eyes. And then he'd kept rolling, because he couldn't stop, because none of them could. And he'd caught the ballad, and the storm, and the melody riding on top of the thunder, and the duet, and the spiritual braided through the concert theme, and Silas Monroe on his feet, and Silas Monroe bowing. 1,200 people watched it live. By dawn it was 2 million. By the end of the week, it was north of 40 million. And it did not stop there. Because a thing like that does not stay in one place. It jumps from phone to phone and city to city and heart to heart like a current looking for ground. And here's what was strange about the way it spread. People did not share it for the humiliation. They shared it for the turn. They shared it because every single person watching had, at some point in their own life, I's been the one in the borrowed cardigan. Told they didn't belong. I told to go find a mop. Told in some polite or impolite way that the room they wanted was not for their kind. And here, at last, was 15 seconds of the moment. They had all been waiting their whole lives to see. The moment the door opens, the moment the person who was never supposed to be heard becomes impossible to ignore. Teachers played it in classrooms. Parents played it for their kids at the dinner table. Old musicians who had given up watched it and cried in their kitchens. And somewhere in the noise of it, 100 quiet conversations started up in 100 institutions that had their own version of a pre-screening committee, their own version of a closed fence, their own version of a man who looked at a neighborhood and a last name and decided in advance who was material and who was not. Because once the whole country has watched a 15-year-old play a masterpiece she learned on a dead piano in a basement, the excuse that talent like that simply isn't out there in neighborhoods like Dunbar stops working. It stops working forever. That was the thing the man alone in the front row could not undo. No matter how long he sat there, he could not make the country unsee it. He had spent 3 generations of his family's authority deciding who got to walk through his front doors, and it had all come apart in 10 minutes. On a phone, in the hands of a boy who'd only been trying to record somebody's tears. The silence did not just cost him his evening. It cost him the whole story he'd been telling his entire life. And the country was writing a different one now. And he wasn't holding the pen. 3 weeks later, Nia Ellison walked through the front doors of the Ashford Conservatory of Music. Not the service entrance. Not the loading dock her aunt used at 3 in the morning. Not through a gap in anybody's fence. The front doors. The ones under the arch with the name carved in the marble. And she walked through them as the winner of the Vanguard Prize. On a full scholarship that covered everything. Tuition and instrument and lessons and every master class. The only thing required of her being her hands and her willingness to work. And she had both. And she always had. Roland Ashford was no longer running the pre-screening committee. The conservatory's board. In an emergency meeting 3 days after a video of their director calling a 15-year-old prodigy, the help was viewed 2 million times. Had seen to that. They had also done something the classical world had been debating for a generation, and never quite had the courage to do. The Ashford Conservatory announced that beginning that year, all scholarship auditions would be blind. Every applicant behind an opaque screen, judged on nothing but the sound. The judges forbidden to know the neighborhood or the last name or the color of the hands making the music. It is a real reform. It has been proven, again and again, to change who gets in. And it happened at the Ashford because one girl who was never supposed to be heard made herself impossible to ignore. Chandler Ashford, freed at last from the crushing weight of being an Ashford, quietly switched to a repertoire he could actually love, and got better. And, improbably, then not so improbably, became friends with Nia, the two of them practicing in adjoining rooms. And it turned out the kid had a good heart under all his father's expectations after all. And down on Dunbar Avenue, 2 blocks from the church, Elias Ward kept his promise. He put 3 upright pianos into the community center. Donated. Second-hand. Lovingly restored by his own hands. The hands of a piano technician who had finally found something worth tuning them for. He hung a hand-painted sign over the door that read the Nia Ellison music program. Because when he'd asked Nia what to call it, She hadn't hesitated for even a second. Free lessons, the flyer said. Any child, any family. No audition, no fee. If you can walk in the door, you can play. The first Saturday, 4 kids showed up. By the end of the month, it was 19, and they had to split the schedule. By spring, there was a waiting list, and Silas Monroe himself came through on his way between cities and sat with those kids for an entire afternoon. An old master in a room full of children from a neighborhood the world had written off, doing the one thing he'd spent 50 years trying to do, making sure they got found before they got lost. And Nia Ellison came back to Dunbar every Saturday she could. Full scholarship at the finest conservatory in the state. Personal student of the greatest pianist alive. And every Saturday she took the train back to the neighborhood. The trains ran through. And she sat down next to some 8-year-old at a second-hand upright and put her cracked hands over their small ones and showed them where the melody lived. And how to lean it, so it would sing. Here's where I could tie it up with a neat bow and tell you what it all means. But I think you already know. Nia Ellison didn't sit down at that Steinway to prove anybody wrong. She didn't walk onto that stage for revenge. She walked onto it because she'd been ready for 10 years, and nobody had bothered to open a door. She played that dead piano in that dark basement every single morning. Not because a teacher assigned it, not because a program required it, not because anyone was ever going to hear, but because the promise she'd made to an old man with a brass metronome was the promise, and keeping it was the whole point, whether or not the world ever gave her a reason to. The keys never asked what she was wearing. The keys never charged her tuition. The keys never once cared whose hands found them in the dark. They just gave her back exactly what she put in, which was everything she had. Every morning, for 10 years, into the silence, on faith. And that's the thing about the girl at the church basement piano, and the boy on the busted keyboard, and the kid in every neighborhood the world drives past with the windows up. They are not waiting for permission. They are not waiting to be discovered. They are already playing. Right now. In the dark. Better than anyone in any gilded room. And the only question that has ever mattered is whether anyone is going to be decent enough, or brave enough, or awake enough to walk over and open the door. Elias Ward waited 2 years to open one, and it nearly cost the world a genius. Silas Monroe spent 50 years opening every one he could find. Roland Ashford held one closed his whole life, and it cost him everything. Which one are you? Because there is a 15-year-old somewhere near you tonight, playing something extraordinary on something broken. In a room nobody visits, keeping a promise nobody knows about. And they are not asking to be handed anything. They are only asking to be heard. Just once. Out loud. For real. Genius does not wait for an invitation. It plays in the dark until the door finally opens. It never asked to be handed anything. It only ever asked to be heard. And the tragedy is never the silence in that basement. The tragedy is every one of us who walked past the door and told ourselves it wasn't ours to open. So go open one, and somewhere across the city tonight, in the basement of a church on Dunbar Avenue, there is still an old upright piano, with a warped soundboard and rusted strings, sitting against a cinder block wall in the dark. And it still doesn't make a sound. There is a brass metronome on top of it, wound and ticking, keeping time in an empty room. And there is a girl who could be practicing on any of the perfect concert grands uptown. Who comes down there sometimes anyway. Late. Alone. And sits at those dead keys where it all began. And plays a whole ballad in total silence. Just to remember. Just to keep the promise. Just to feel her grandfather's hand on her shoulder one more time. Because you never forget where the door was. even after somebody finally opens it. Dick, Dick, Dick. If this story moved you, subscribe and tell me in the comments, who's the one person who kept time for you when nobody else was listening? Say their name. And if you know a kid playing in the dark right now, go be the one who opens the door.